Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. Today, let's talk about alphabet soup. Is this suddenly some sort of cooking show? No, it's not. But today, I'm going to talk about something that is, I don't know if I'd say symbolic, but it's certainly stereotypical in many people's thoughts when they think about the tech industry, the IT industry. Acronyms. Acronyms can be really frustrating if you don't know what they are. Even if you feel like you know something about tech, and if you were actually told what it was, you might be able to puzzle it out. If it's just a bunch of letters and you have no idea what those letters are supposed to stand for, it can feel like people are just talking over your head. They're using their own shorthand, their own kind of slang, and it's sometimes to the point where you can start to feel like they're doing this intentionally. They're trying to shut you out. They're trying to be opaque and unscrutable because they may as well be speaking Turkish or Greek, if you want a more stereotypical turn of phrase in the English language. A foreign language. And it is a sort of foreign language. It's just geek or techies. So why do we have these acronyms? What are some of the more common ones? Why do we continue to use these acronyms? And is there a point where it can become just too much? Too much for sanity. Okay, so first off, why do we have these acronyms? Well, quite honestly, a lot of the time, it's because we're talking about things that have a really long official name, and it's a lot shorter if you can just use the initials. That's purely it for a lot of these. For example, DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Okay, it tells you what it is, dynamic, okay, so it just happens as it happens. Host, we're talking about end stations, computers. Configuration, okay, it's going to tell it how to configure something. Protocol, okay, it's a spec. But if I were to say dynamic host configuration protocol every single time, instead of just DHCP, it would get to be a bit much. And in the tech world, a lot of people know what DHCP is. They may not understand fully how it works, but most people go, oh, DHCP, that's how IP addresses get assigned. It's one way that IP addresses can get assigned, yes, and certainly one of the most common ways of assigning IPs. So people know what that is. DNS, Domain Name System, okay? We're talking about domains, the labels in the URLs and the address bars of your browser. Name, yeah, okay, we're naming things, and it's a system for doing so. Okay, well, the domain name system this and the domain name system that and the domain name system the other thing versus just DNS, 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 DNS. It's shorter. It's easier to say. So that's why we use things like that. But if I'm going to just start using acronyms out of nowhere, that can be pretty alienating. And if I even use the common acronyms like DHCP or DNS, if you don't know what it is, it's probably just as alienating. Something that I try to do, and this entire channel is a good example of that, is I try to explain what's happening. I try to explain to the people that I work with and the people that I do work for what it is in a way that they can understand it. If you don't know what DHCP is, but the server is not working. You say, okay, so there's a server on your network which handles assigning addresses to the various machines. And that server is just not handing out addresses properly right now. That's what I'm fixing. Okay, people understand that. Now, did that take longer to say then? DHCP is down and we're working on it. Yes, that absolutely took a lot longer. But did it really? Because now my customer doesn't have to say, well, what is DHCP? What does it mean? And they don't have to feel like they have to pester the IT guy to get an actual answer that they can understand. So you still need to be careful with your acronyms and use them with the appropriate audience, because there's nothing worse than anybody at any level of techspertise. There's nothing worse than feeling like you're just either not included, or worse, you feel like you're too dumb to understand what's going on. It's not a matter of being smart or dumb, intelligent or not. It has everything to do with knowing what the acronym is. Can you take that too far? Yes, you absolutely can, with the results that we just mentioned. And even if you think you know what your audience is, you can still take it way too far. So, as an example of this, I was taking a certification exam recently. It's a Cisco certification exam. And every time I take a Cisco exam, I am reminded how much Cisco loves to flood people with acronyms. Something common like DHCP, DNS, sure, you understand what those are. As a network admin, you understand what those are, or you're really not much of a network admin in the first place. They're just common. They're just bread and butter. But if we're suddenly talking about, EOMPLS, unless you're working with that technology, EOMPLS, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody just said, bless you, try again. It's just, there's nothing there that tells you that you're talking about Ethernet over multi-protocol label switching. And yet you can see immediately why you would use that acronym rather than Ethernet over multi-protocol label switching. EOMPLS is a lot faster to say. Okay, so maybe that one's understandable. Okay, well, how about FI? What's an FI? In this case, it's a fabric interconnect. Okay, that really doesn't seem like that would be so difficult to type out, particularly on an exam. That's 2 words, fabric interconnect. Is there a reason to abbreviate it FI? Okay, how about VRRP v3? Okay, if you've done some of your, if you've worked in the industry for a while, you can guess that the V3 at the end is probably version 3, and you'd be right. So then you're left with VRRP, okay? In this case, Virtual Router Redundancy Protocol. All right, that one's maybe a little easier, but everything is an acronym. Everything. And when you're looking at a diagram saying, okay, which one of these is an E port, an F port, a TN port, an N port, an NP port, a TE port, and you're like, this is just letters. This is just letters. And sure, in a certification exam, you're supposed to know what these mean. Cool, I get that. But it also starts to look like artificial difficulty. Because, again, this is written out. When you're using this in conversation, it's kind of natural for people to start short forming things. This is how slang works in languages all over the world. Tech is no different. But in a written exam, you start going, okay, if these are all options, what benefit is it to say an E port rather than an end port or end node port? Okay, so I mean, if you're talking about an endpoint port or an end port, you've reduced it to one letter E port. Okay, what have you saved? In a written exam where nobody has to actually speak this out, what have you saved? A whole 2 letters? That's where it starts to become something that looks like artificial difficulty. You're like, well, I know my audience. They should absolutely know what this is. You can still take that too far. And it becomes just too much. Too much. I do think that the tech industry as a whole tends to become somewhat insular. You know, we rely on the audience knowing what we're talking about. But tech is a very broad industry, right? It's huge. The fact that you know what CPU means does not necessarily mean that you know what OTV is, overlay transport virtualization. The fact that you understand what RAM is does not mean that you necessarily understand what FHRP is, first hop routing protocol. But we treat this as, oh, there's a whole bunch of acronyms, and that's cool because it's kind of our club speak. It's the way that you show that you're a member of the club. This should not be a club. There's all sorts of room for people to move in and out of an industry, and there's all sorts of room for people within an industry to put together their own social groups, their own professional associations, what have you. All of that's fine. But when you start using things to exclude other people intentionally, that's where it can get a little more challenging, because the people who are excluded really do feel that. And especially if you get in the habit of doing that and you don't remember to take it down a notch, if you're talking to a customer, the customer feels excluded. And when the customer feels excluded, that's where resentments start to build up. That's where people start losing trust in their IT folks, in their admins. So I think it's a good idea in general to practice pulling back on the massive use of acronyms and practice explaining things by analogy. Because you can say, oh yeah, well, the routing process, the EIGRP routing process crashed and it's not redistributing routes into BGP, yada, yada, yada. And if you're a professional, maybe you understand that. But it's just as, okay, I can't say it's just as easy, but it is a lot more approachable to tell a customer, hey, so there is a process that works a little bit like a traffic director. It figures out what roads are open and what roads are closed. And it has to relay that information to a different traffic director out on the main internet. And they've got their signals mixed up and they're not exchanging that information properly. Did that take longer to think of and actually explain? Yes, absolutely. But it's more approachable. And for a customer, the ability to feel like you kind of understand what's going on is massive. You don't have to understand how to fix it. You don't have to understand how massively complicated it might be. You just need to understand a little bit of what's going on. And that's true for everybody. So it's a good thing to practice being able to share things by way of analogy, explaining it for people who might be professionals, because I may have been talking to a CPA. They're absolutely a professional, because what do I know about accounting? Nothing. But they have their area of expertise, and I have my area of expertise. The fact that they don't know anything necessarily about IT doesn't mean that they're dumb, doesn't mean that they just don't get it. Maybe they don't, but they are a professional in their own field. So it doesn't hurt me any to work on explaining things to that person in a way that they understand kind of what's going on, and they're okay to let me work on that because, hey, they have a little bit of an understanding, so that's good. All right, so I've talked about that probably enough, probably too much for some people, so if you're still with me, good on. So yeah, there you go. If you have thoughts on other things that you would like to hear me talk about, more interesting than this maybe not, who knows? It's probably a matter of perspective. And if you have thoughts on things that you'd like to see me demonstrate as well, either way, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. I am your next door netadmin, and we will see you next time.